Hi, everybody. Thank you for rejoining us for FC Build. We're in day one, and I'm sure a number of you just had a great lunch. Thanks for tuning back in. For those of you who are tuning in for the first time in day one, just a very quick recap on FC Build. This is an enterprise conference hosted by Foundation Capital. I'm one of the partners here at Foundation Capital. We're an early stage venture firm. We principally focus on investing in enterprise and fintech. We typically lead early stage deals, which are usually seed and Series A investments. And we come in very, very early into the opportunity. We've been doing this since 1995, so 26 years, and are currently investing our 10th fund. And I focus on enterprise investing here at the firm, and I lead IT and cybersecurity investments for us. So let's get started with the panel. And the panel's topic is a very important one for founders. It's build or buy. And we have two fantastic Fortune 50 executives on the line with us. I'm going to ask them to both briefly introduce themselves to the audience that we have here, as well as, as you talk a little bit about things, Vishy and Terry, about your backgrounds, just share with us a little bit about the size of your IT infrastructure and the number of people who are on your team and broadly on the IT team as well. Vishy, maybe if we could start with you.
Sure. Good afternoon, and thank you, Sid. My name is Vishy Gopalakrishnan. I work at AT&T. I work for our Chief Technology Officer, and we are in the middle of a pretty major technology transformation that's obviously a multi-year journey for us. So I specifically focus on four things. One, I own the transformation roadmap for the technology journey that we're on over the next 3 to 5 years. I also own the program management, which is the investment that goes into the transformation, as also on the other side of the ledger, the kind of the value realization. As you can imagine, the scale of the company that we are, the amount of investment is pretty significant. So it's something that my boss has to go and talk to the board every quarter and to our CEO every month. So I do those two things. So those are more kind of strategy and program management. Then I have three core kind of technology platforms that I run for the whole company. One of them is our entire, think of it as the entire kind of complex of middleware, integration gateways, API gateways. Just to give you a sense of kind of the volume of transactions, so that entire set of technologies handles about 11 trillion transactions a month, okay, with a T. So that's every time you walk into an AT&T store, want to upgrade to the iPhone 13 Plus, all of the validation in terms of dipping into our CRM system, you're a valid customer, what kind of plan are you eligible for an upgrade, all of that. So that's about 11 trillion transactions a month. And so we are in the middle of actually evolving that to support a public cloud, multi-SaaS kind of environment. So that's kind of one technology platform. I'm also in the middle of rolling out an enterprise-wide CMDB project. So that will essentially consolidate about 70 different systems we have currently within the company that handle all assets, not just IT assets, but also all of the network assets. So every strand of fiber, every pedestal that's part of our AT&T fiber network, every part of our core backbone, everything that's in our 70,000 cell towers, et cetera. And the third part that I also manage for the company is all of the kind of the upfront SDLC tools related to project and portfolio management for all of our software delivery. And kind of pick your favorites, Jira, Align, Rike, Monday.com, all of that. And we're in the middle of consolidating all of that. So the software development lifecycle tools support about 30,000 practitioners inside the company. So hopefully that gives you a sense of kind of this breadth and scope of my responsibility.
That's amazing. And Vishy, how many people on the tech team at AT&T?
Let's see. My team, the team that handles all of this, is about 200 people.
Wow.
The organization that I'm part of is about 7,000.
Wow.
But that's just like one component. This whole other team that manages our network, right? Which is, the network is actually orders of magnitude larger than kind of the IT function within a company like ours.
Absolutely. Terry, if you could just briefly introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about the scale of the infrastructure at MetLife.
I'm just still impressed with all the stuff that Vishy is doing. So my name is Terry Luciani. I lead the innovation effort at MetLife. That's really driving innovation both internally and externally across the company. Just to give a small snapshot of technology, right? It's one of the largest organizations within the company. We work with them very closely, and it's covering all of the areas that you would expect in a large Fortune 50. So that's sort of the quick intro, Sid.
It's awesome. And Terry, how many people on the tech team at MetLife?
It's in the thousands.
Yeah. So both of you lead, digital transformation, digital innovation at two iconic Fortune 50 companies. I mean, the great thing is neither of you need to introduce what AT&T and MetLife do to the audience. We're talking a little bit about build or buy. So let's start with kind of that journey. You have a project that is up for debate. How do you make that decision internally? Should we build this internally or should we buy an external vendor? Terry, maybe we could start with you on this one.
I think we take the decision very seriously, and we used to be primarily a build shop. You might be surprised. We have a really rich history of significant technology leadership. We had one of the first mainframes. We actually had one of the first business networks. We even built our own computing language called Met English, which I believe there's a Wikipedia page. So there is a history of technology there, but we did learn over time that you have to make really informed choices on whether to build or not. And there are positives to building, right? You own the IP. You can build something really custom to your needs. There's also a lot of challenges, and some challenges that, a risk manager might not want to put resources to. So we're really careful. We're really deliberate about how we proceed in the space. And we are constantly looking to see, is there a large enough gap, right, in the market? Are the capabilities out there not robust enough? And if we notice that, we then entertain the idea of building. And our latest development in the space is something called Upwise, which is our new financial wellness app. However, I have to say, we are very big fans of the partnership model, working with entrepreneurs who are focused on solving issues. That has been a real differentiator for us. And it's, just one of the reasons why we love to work with incredible partners like Foundation.
It's awesome. And Vishy, how do you think about things at AT&T? You described a few projects you're working on right now. How do you make a decision? Should we use a vendor or should we just build this internally?
This probably comes as no surprise, but my answer thematically will be almost identical to Terry's. Mm-hmm. If you had asked me this question maybe 3 to 5 years ago, we were very much on the build part of the spectrum, right? Because like any self-respecting IT organization in a reasonably large enterprise, the developers always think they can build everything better than the market can. And oh, by the way, we have special requirements, right? Stop me if you've not heard that before. So I think what's happened is there's been a pivot to realizing that the pace of innovation that happens outside in the market, so there's a pace, and the volume of innovation. So it's both the pace and the volume of innovation is not anything that we could manage or deal with. And so it just becomes a case of, are you better off allocating your scarce resources? Even though we are a large company, resources are always finite. Are you better off investing it in something else? And where do you get strategic differentiation in the market? Is it with experience? Is it with the quality of the network that we build out? And so we've chosen to emphasize that as opposed to kind of building by default, right? But so I would say it's been an evolution. I think now it's very much a public cloud first, SaaS first mentality across the company. That it has to be something extremely, the bar is very high if you want to build it. There better be a very strong requirement, whether it's a compliance or a regulatory requirement, or there's something very, very kind of onerous and strict that requires you to do that a commercial construct won't allow you to.
And as we get into kind of the next stage, let's say you choose to buy a product. In that vendor selection process, have you already made the decision that you're not going to build before you get into vendor selection? Or is that still an option that you say, well, let's go and look at all the vendors and then we may go back to building?
I would say, I think, I'm not going to say there's like a clear kind of black and white. I think most of the time, the choice has already been made that this is a capability. I mean, it's very hard for me to think of, if you look at business capabilities wise, whether it's, CRM, ITSM, change management, vulnerability management, GRC workflows. The reality is a lot of these business capabilities have, in some sense, been, I would say, kind of codified and standardized in the market. So, and they're packaged in a way and they get innovated in a way, especially from a SaaS perspective, right? I mean, it's the upgrade cycle is ongoing. So I think we pretty much decided that we want to procure this. Unless we find, I'm not going to say it's never happens. It's highly unlikely that we're going to be surprised, either by the economics or capabilities, right? That may still happen, but highly unlikely in the current market.
Terry, do you think it's the same at MetLife, or do you think that option is always available?
Yeah, I think it's a big hurdle, right? Build is expensive. Build takes time. I mean, could we design a word processor? Sure. It doesn't make a lot of sense for us to do that. And I think we do our research, right? We look at what's in the market. And like I said before, if we notice it's a big enough gap, if we notice that capabilities are missing, then we'll entertain it. But there are so many incredible startups out there with just founders really dedicated to driving customer solutions. And so much has been done to create easy ways to integrate. It's really a high hurdle. I think Vishy's right. There's a lot of decisions that need to be made in order to move forward with the build.
That's fantastic to hear. And for all founders who are listening, look, if you get a decision that says we've decided to go and build a product from AT&T or MetLife, you know that you have two gentlemen here who can reaffirm that that's a very huge exception. So keep that in mind. That's a cop-out answer if you get passed on for that reason. Terry, staying with you, what is the vendor selection process like at MetLife, and is it a standardized process, or does it really differ depending on the project and the person who's running that project?
Yeah, I think selecting a vendor is actually somewhat easy, right? Getting them in the door is a whole different story. That's difficult. That's arduous. That's not for the faint of heart. Our job, right, in the innovation team, that's to find the right vendor. We spend a lot of time really trying to work to figure out how do we find solutions that are going to serve and solve for this business or technology problem. And before we do anything, right, we want to make sure we vet that startup. We get them in front of our business partners. If we believe there's an opportunity, our preference is always, let's run a simple experiment with very clear success measures. And the reason we do that is really to make sure that we can truly measure the value, right? And give both MetLife and the startup easy line of sight to decide whether or not we're going to move forward. But this is where things get, let's call it spicy, right? You're working with a Fortune 500 company and a company focused on risk. You have to understand there's steps now that you have to follow. You have the architects ensuring that the capability we want to bring in is not existing on our stack. And then going in front of the architects and arguing why we need this additional capability. You have procurement and legal folks that are trying to ensure that everything's being done the right way. The contract is up to standards, beneficial both to MetLife and the startup party. And then, of course, there's all the security work and the requirements that come in there. So I think that's why it's sort of a two-headed piece, right? It's somewhat easy to find great capabilities, but getting them in the door is hard. And I'd say if I have to give any advice to the founders that are out there, you got to have some patience with the process. You really have to dedicate the right resources to this. And you have to go your own way with sort of the legal review. But, any type of detailed legal effort on behalf of the startup where you start editing our paper, our NDAs, that's where you start to see the challenge become even more difficult.
Vishy?
I would say, pretty much kind of in line with what Terry said. I think there is a process, and the process exists for a reason, like Terry said. It's been honed and kind of in some, I don't want to say perfected. I think it's getting refined all the time because I think it protects our interests. I think it protects the vendor's interests as well, because the relationships we typically want are more than transactional. And so if you want to build a long-standing strategic relationship, I think then there has to be the kind of, you have, I'll use the word invest, but what I mean by that is like, you have to commit to that relationship, and that commitment comes in the form of, like Terry said, kind of understanding that, okay, there'll be some give and take. There's definitely an asymmetry between, a typical startup and companies of our size. So yes, recognize that and work with, the people who are kind of helping you shepherd that process. And at the end of the day, and then the vendor, the provider has to make a call. Do they really want to kind of stay invested in this and kind of push it through or not? And that's okay, right? Because not all relationships are for all parties, right? And so you have to have the ability to kind of, maybe respectfully say no, Mr. Customer, right? Maybe not the right thing now. That's okay.
I think that's really important feedback. I mean, I tell that to my founders all the time that, hey, you have to be willing to say no, particularly with the very, very large companies. At some point, the answer may actually be no, not today. Maybe we'll come back to you when we have some scale.
Right.
Because when you're working with Vishy and his team and they have 7,000 people there and you have 20 people at the company at your startup, maybe the answer is Vishy and his team can spend as much time as possible for the next few years trying to debate this decision, and you may not have that opportunity.
And I think that's personally, I would just say, just for me, like in my team, like one of the things we try to do, especially when we work with startups, is kind of recognizing that the most kind of valuable currency for startups is time. Yeah. And it's okay for my team to say no as well, right? So I push my team. It's okay to say no. Don't feel obliged that you have to prolong this conversation. Be emphatic. Don't be arbitrary, right? Don't just say no. Tell them no why, right? Because I think the founders would value that, right? The startup would value the input. Because I think, to your point, Sid, it's very easy for a company like ours, given the asymmetry in a lot of these relationships, for us to give whiplash. And the worst thing for a startup is like you have one customer. And it's like, no, that's not good for either one.
Yeah, Sid, just to add to that, I think Vishy's right on to something. And we try really hard to be upfront with you as a startup founder. We try to be very clear because we do respect your time. And, we'll say things sometimes. Have you worked with a Bank of America, a Citibank, an American Express? Because if you haven't, right, and you're going to work with us for the first time, we're going to go through those challenges with you, right? But if you've been through their processes, they're somewhat similar. Like an AT&T, a MetLife, we're going to have some enterprise processes. So in many cases, it's not us trying to be difficult. It's us trying to protect both us and you. We're trying to be really conscious of the time and the effort that's required here.
And Terry, maybe sticking on that point, is there a size of startup that you would prefer to work with? Do you tell them, hey, unless you have this many customers, or unless you have this much of funding, or unless you've had your product out for this many years, we're not the right partner? Is there something that you give?
I'll never say, hey, we don't work with seed companies, but I have noticed our track record is, the A's and the B's are usually where we start because they've had some experience, right? They're used to going through the contract, the MSA process. They're used to security reviews. They have the team to handle it. Usually when you get too small, it's just, we can be overwhelming. And, it's just not ready yet for something at an enterprise level. Now, that doesn't mean we don't want to work with them. We won't do sometimes a test, but anything bigger, it does become a bit more complex when you get to the really early stage companies.
Got it. So Series A and beyond, and really kind of early growth stage, at least, ideally. Vishy, is that the same at AT&T? Is it different?
Yeah, almost identical.
That's identical. Yeah. And for those of you listening in, if you have any questions for Vishy and Terry, please put them in the comment section. We're already starting to get questions coming in. Robert, hopefully this answered your question around, at what stage should a startup be? We have another question from Julian. I'm going to take some poetic license and try to add in a secondary question. Julian asked, what are the top 3 things that you wish vendors did? Let me change that to top 1 or 2 for both of you. And I want to add in there also, what are the mistakes that you've seen vendors make? Vishy, do you want to get started?
Sure.
One or two things that they've done well, and then that they
so are you saying one thing they've done well?
Yeah,
Sorry.
an example, exactly.
Yeah,
An example of a vendor and a situation that was great, and then a thing that you see common mistakes.
I think it's, I guess this is just like a classic kind of, like, well, a company that we worked with, they did a phenomenal job of coming in and talking to us about the technology that they were kind of bringing to the market in the context of as a telco, right? Because they were focused on the customer lifecycle, but applying AI and ML to kind of the acquisition part of it. And so they were able to speak, look, at the end of the day, customer acquisition is a very horizontal process, but there are some quirks in terms of how telcos handle it, between call center and retail and digital. There's some specific things, et cetera, and promotions. They were able to kind of situate the specific technology innovation in the context of the vertical, right? So there is a lingo, the kind of the terminology, kind of the specific outcomes that are very grounded in what a telco customer like ours would have to do, so that we as a buyer, a potential buyer, are not left trying to connect the dots. Okay, amazing technology, 10x performance, 50% the price. Okay, now, how would I go talk to the VP of customer acquisition? What would this do to their CAC? Okay, and they had done all of that for us, so that made it like super easy. I think the one thing that I would say that where we run into kind of recurring issues is amazing technology, amazing innovation, amazing feat of engineering. However, the fact that companies like ours are, I call us, we're the mother of all brownfields. Right? So you go in, and so how does this technology kind of, enter into this environment? Right? Because the credentials of the technology are not in question, but that's not going to get you kind of into the technology infrastructure. So how does it make its entry into it? Is it going to be a good citizen with all of the different parts of the IT ecosystem, including security, et cetera, et cetera? And yeah, you may have grand plans to replace all of the kind of the incumbent pieces of the stack, but you're not going to do that in quarter one, quarter two, maybe not even in year one. So how does that land and expand happen technically and kind of from a process perspective?
Terry?
I mean, I definitely agree with Vishy. I mean, one of the points he made is dead on. I'd say I think about it as two things, right? There's expertise and engagement. And so when I think about expertise, do some homework before you meet with us, right? You don't want to drink Pepsi in a Coca-Cola meeting. And I know it's a silly example, but do you know how many people in the first time they're meeting us spell MetLife wrong? They do capital M-E-T lowercase l, or they do capital M-E-T space life. And I know that's so trivial and silly, but it's the first interaction, and already attention to details called into question. And it's not a hard thing to figure out, right? Knowing whether or not we have a retail business in the US, or how we sell to customers, or are we a health insurer, right, in the US? Good questions to know and answer before you meet us, right? So do some work in the expertise side to come in informed. And then when you engage us, right, anybody who engages with a heavy sales routine, I got to tell you, it damages the relationship quickly, because it's just not a great way to start. But if you come into the meeting and you have a purpose to experiment, right? To demonstrate a capability that you believe will bring value to both of us, that does something different, right? And to Vishy's point before, and I'm completely in agreement, make it easy for us, right? Lay out the best way to test your capabilities. How can we do something quick for little to no money, right? There's so many competing priorities and folks are so busy. Make it as easy as possible. And if things go well, you're then in a position to make that sale. So really just know who you're speaking to, know what we're about, and come in with a value add, not coming in with, I want to sell you. I think those are two things that I would highlight.
That's it's incredibly helpful. I think this point around, showing value in advance and where you can add value to that specific customer is not just helpful for MetLife and AT&T, it's helpful for all customers. I think it is really important as founders to come into a meeting and say, this is how we can add value for you. And ideally, if you have numbers that you can identify, this is how much money we can save you, or this is how much we can improve your existing efficiency in an app, it adds even more value, of course.
And Sid, can I just build on that?
Sure.
So I think the quantifiable piece is an interesting one. I've seen it sometimes be a double-edged sword, because sometimes we've had companies come in and say, "Hey, here's an ROI calculator, and you do this, blah 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 blah," and all good, right? So, which means that okay, you thought about value, you thought about the outcomes, and what are the inputs to kind of driving that outcome. Instead of being extremely definitive about, "Hey, this is the answer," and this may just be a framing, but I think it changes the temperature in the room to say, "Hey, look, we've thought about the situations in which we can provide business value. Here's a framework to kind of figure out what this looks like. We've plopped in a bunch of stuff here based on publicly available information and some diligence. Can we work with you to refine this model?"
Yeah.
Because a lot of times, the moment you show the model and you say, "These are the numbers," you've opened yourself for like, "Well, I don't agree with that. We need to take that down 50%. And that needs to go down by 20%. Well, we're more efficient than that." And then all of a sudden, it just devolves into this, like, is the math right? And all of a sudden, you're just like off in, nowhere, basically, right?
Oh.
It's a framing thing.
Yeah, so ask for feedback in your process. Know the value, but ask for feedback. I think it's...
And I think it also gives you a good gauge on how engaged is the customer, right? Because the more they involve and say, "Well, have you thought about this?" Like, "Oh, okay, no, let's do that," right?
And there is a legitimacy, Sid, right? Like if I see something in a deck that says, Vishy at AT&T saved, X amount of transactions, right? There's something more. You're not telling me how much I'll save, but you're putting in a reputable brand with a name. There's something to that.
So the case studies do help.
Yes.
Sure.
Yeah.
Mahendra asked a good question. It's a very apt one. If we could put it up on screen, the question is what risks do startups create for your organizations? So for AT&T and MetLife, and how best should founders understand this complexity? Why are you not as excited about working with startups? Because of the problems that they may create. Terry, if you want to get started there.
Well, we're always excited to work with startups. So I'll caveat it there. But one thing you guys need to understand is that when we work with you, we try to think of it from a customer perspective, that it's not, "Oh, you're using MetLife and this startup." Their relationship is with MetLife. It's a MetLife experience. So if there's any problems, if something happens with customer data, if there's a security issue, anything that will make the company look bad, that's the issue, right? Our greatest asset that we have is our brand. And we do a lot of work. It's very hard to build a brand up for 150 years. And so we do a lot of work to protect that brand. So I think it really comes down to, we want to work with you. We want to engage our customers in new and different ways. We want to solve some of their biggest challenges, and we need your help to do it. But there's a risk involved. So that's why we're very careful. That's why there's so many different processes and just rules and ways of working that you need to follow. That's definitely one of the pieces here. And I think that's one of the biggest issues we all face as being large, customer-facing enterprises.
Vishy?
Yeah, I think there is there's a tremendous amount of kind of, reputational risk, right? On the downside, right? If there were something to happen, we have 130 million wireless subscribers, right? We carry a third of the kind of the internet backbone traffic. So, anything that happens, it's not that you don't have incidents or outages, right? Yes. But what is your ability to respond to that in a timely manner, 24/7, both from the technology, but then do you have an appreciation that as the relationship evolves, you will have to stand up, I would call it the process infrastructure on top of your technology infrastructure to handle a customer like us, right? Who represents, all of these like 130 million wireless subscriber relationships, broadband fiber relationships, all the enterprise relationships. So you are behind the scenes, but you better have the ability to scale your process infrastructure to handle that. So there's a kind of a rigor around their process infrastructure that is demanded. And I think understanding that and being open to that and having that conversation, I don't think our expectation is that, you're a startup, that you're going to kind of, a priori have all of that built out, right, in advance. But do you have the ability, have you shown the ability to A, understand and internalize that, and B, the flexibility to evolve and understand that that is investment that you'll have to make, that will stand you in good stead with all of the other Fortune 100, Fortune 500 customers as well.
Yep.
I want to move things a little bit around and speak less about vendor selection, move into some other topics.
Sure.
Rishi, you're at AT&T. You've been broadly in the wireless world for a while at a number of different companies, not just AT&T, Nokia as well. We've started to see the rollout of 5G infrastructure,
right,
both in the US and globally. How do you think 5G is going to transform IT organizations and ultimately impact employees? I mean, we're seeing this space of private 5G.
Sure.
And maybe if you could connect that with opportunities for founders to create companies.
Right.
Category, that'd be very helpful.
Yeah, so maybe I'll just kind of do a little kind of step back in terms of just 5G itself, just a couple of kind of factoids about 5G, right? Just from a kind of a speed, and as technologists, we like to focus on the speeds and feeds. So 4G has a kind of a theoretical maximum bandwidth of 300 megabits per second. Okay, theoretical. Okay. 5G takes that to at least a gigabit per second, and you can go up above that depending on the part of the spectrum you're using. The other part that you get is in terms of the density of devices. In LTE, you can go up to about 1,000 devices per square kilometer. With 5G, you can accommodate up to 1 million devices a square kilometer.
Wow.
Okay. So what does that mean? So what that means is, and the way the the 5G architecture has evolved, it allows for how workloads get distributed. And so we've evolved from, talk about like mainframe to client server to cloud, right? And if you think about in the cloud, so you have I'm just going to grossly oversimplify, 2 endpoints. There's a cloud and there's an endpoint. And with 5G, what you're able to do, the architecture allows you to, because of the low latency and the high bandwidths, you can actually move processing much closer to the edge, as close to the end user, the end customer as possible, right? So what that means is that experiences, I'll just use experiences in air quotes, that need extremely low latency or that are highly susceptible to jitter, or are very susceptible to kind of, the round trip time involved in going back to, whether it's, AWS East or AWS West, etc. You can't tolerate that round trip time. All of a sudden, with 5G, you can actually move workloads closer to the edge, whether that's, I'm just going to hypothetically say, at the base of a cell tower, or in a device that is actually within the enterprise perimeter, and do a lot of local processing, do a lot of processing opportunistically at the edge, and then go back to the cloud, et cetera, for kind of other work. So what does that mean? What that means is that we've run into customers, say, in the manufacturing environment, who have a lot of information that they want to process locally, that they don't want, I would call it's hyper-local kind of data sovereignty. They don't want, say, if it's an aircraft manufacturer, they don't want manufacturing data to exit the premises. It's that confidential for them. But you still want connectivity back to a cloud or a private data center, et cetera. So there are technologies that we built out in partnership with Microsoft Azure, for example, that allows for localized processing, whether it's for some localized image processing for quality control purposes, or for safety purposes. You want to say, okay, you know what, Sid is approaching this assembly line. Can I make sure that Sid is actually certified to work on this assembly line? Can I use image recognition to figure out, does he have the right safety equipment? Is he operating this equipment properly? Like all of that stuff, I just want to have locally processed, etc. I cannot tolerate the latency that's involved, regardless of how high speed my connection is back to the cloud. So that's kind of one kind of set of use cases. There's a variety of use cases on the kind of outside of those localized situations, whether it's in any kind of, I would just call it XR, AR, MR, VR kind of environments, where again, these applications either require heavy duty kind of processing. You need to have souped up, devices with GPUs, etc. if you're in the gaming business, etc. Is there a possibility to say, can you actually do kind of multiplayer gaming and immersive experiences with headsets or not, and use a combination of 5G connectivity and some localized edge computing? So you actually distribute the workload differently from how we've thought about workloads as all the workloads being in the cloud. Now workloads can actually be resident in the edge, and they work harmoniously to actually deliver the best experience. All that being said, I think there's still a lot of opportunity to help, I would say, enterprises figure out, how they take advantage of 5G and edge. Okay? Because the reality is vast majority of enterprises are still navigating around cloud, right? And all of a sudden now you have this other capability, which is 5G and edge. So they're just trying to figure out how I just refactored or I'm refactoring my workload to take advantage of cloud. But depending on the industry vertical I am and where I see the business opportunity, I need to now redo my workload to accommodate this new capability called edge and 5G. How do I do that? Now, does that mean that developers have to learn everything about 5G and edge? That's probably not the right way to do it. So how do you abstract away all of that? Is there an opportunity to kind of specify intentions in terms of what I want from this workload, and then let the magic of orchestration and distributing the workloads happen behind the scenes? I think in my opinion, that's a huge opportunity. Because I think the average developer doesn't understand 5G and should not be forced to understand 5G. Can you abstract all of that away and have the ability to programmatically kind of describe intentions, whether it's in terms of, hey, my P90 for this experience has to be within this threshold, okay, in terms of latency, jitter, etc. Right? Now you figure out infrastructure behind the scenes, how to translate that and monitor that on a real-time basis and do the appropriate adjustments in the back.
Very interesting. So a lot of the opportunity is very much around, hey, how do we connect cloud, edge, and 5G and decide what part of the application is processed at which gate?
Exactly. Because there's a kind of, I would call it, there's a design time element to that. Like how do you kind of minimize the friction? Then there's a whole runtime orchestration kind of component to that. There's also a security part tied to this, because we're just not trying to figure out, okay, how to handle security in a kind of cloud environment, etc. And all of a sudden you introduce another kind of component, another element to the kind of the surface area from a security perspective. How do you have all of that happen without people having to unlearn and relearn new things?
Yeah. Terry, Vishy obviously talked a little bit about 5G and edge being the future, but cloud is currently here right now, and most Fortune 500s are going through that process of moving to the cloud. Could you speak a little bit about where MetLife is in that journey? Did COVID-19 affect the transition or not? And what are the pros and cons that you're kind of measuring as you decide how much you move to the cloud?
Okay. All right. So I wouldn't necessarily call us a leader in the cloud space, but I think as an insurer, we consider our journey to be on par with group and life businesses, right? I think we're open and we're using the cloud in a lot of areas where it makes sense. Obviously, the positives, right, are the cost benefit, the speed to market. But the biggest challenge we're facing is sort of a dual cloud, a bifurcated cloud strategy, where on the one hand, really aggressive adoption in customer-facing solutions. Yet the other hand, we have back-end systems like policy admin systems that are built on pretty elaborate legacy technology. And there's really just no simple solution in the space. So we have this triangle of intense demand, legacy technology, and cloud that I think our architects are continuously balancing, right? From a COVID perspective, it's impacted us, but not as much from the tech side as from the business side, right? There's a lot more pressure to go digital. For example, moving our sales processes globally to digital, mobile solutions, disconnected solutions, co-browsing, right? Efforts which are going to require teams to come together and look at sales and services and really revisualize all the work we're doing. So our architects have done a great job of this, really trying to understand it. I think they have a big role in trying to figure out where the right opportunities are and setting the right guidelines. For example, we've made a decision really to partner with one single cloud provider.
Interesting.
But the challenge is you can't ever move fast enough. And like anything, we're trying to approach this, especially, we're trying to approach cloud with an appreciation for all the challenges that come with it and a focus on, in the end, what's the best solution long-term that we can deliver for the customer.
And how did you mentioned you decided to partner with one cloud provider rather than kind of adopting a multi-cloud strategy? How did you make that decision? I mean, it's not an easy one to make.
It's not. And speaking to the architects, I don't know that they would say that they're 100% certain it's the perfect solution. There's challenges as you get into local areas, specific countries, having a one cloud solution. But I think, there's benefits, right? If you go with AWS, you go with an Azure environment, there's certain things that the enterprise can gain from the single cloud provider.
Sticking with you, Terry, you've been at MetLife for 20 years. A lot has happened at the company over those years. What do you think has really driven innovation? What do you see has worked very well internally? And any advice for other IT leaders who are in the audience today listening in?
Well, I hope, because it's my day job, that I'm doing something to drive innovation across the company. I think it really comes from leadership and sponsorship, right? I could talk to you a little bit about what we do. Internally, we run crowdsourced challenges. We run facilitated challenges, and it's all about leveraging the talent and creativity of our associates to generate brand new ideas. But where we've seen a lot of success is really our co-innovation platform, and that's where we work with external partners. For example, MetLife's work with Foundation, right? We, every year, sit down with business leaders and map out requirements. And those requirements, those strategic goals, those opportunities are where we can leverage this external capability sourcing, right? They're leaders across the organization. They're giving us these requirements, and then we're going back to our venture capital partners and we're mining their portfolios. And they're coming back and saying, hey, look, we have startups that have capabilities that can solve for them. So it gives us the opportunity to really get to that emerging technology, to those new solutions. And each one of those companies we bring in, right, we vet them. And if it's a promising lead, we share it with our business partners. And the goal being, can we find an opportunity that can be tested? And we believe experiments, like I mentioned before, are the best way to determine the feasibility of a capability. Since 2014, we've done over 160 experiments, signed over 72 contracts with startups. Wow. So my advice would be, if you're an innovation leader and you're trying to drive innovation, be really careful who you ask to help you innovate. I think if you ask any leader in a large company, 100% of them are going to say, yes, they're innovative. But the truth is, when push comes to shove, it's probably about 30% are going to do something innovative. So I would say, don't try to convert non-believers. Work with the believers, earn your wins. Those wins will lead to bigger and bigger opportunities.
Vishy, anything to add? And I want to be mindful of time. We're almost out.
I would say, I think, beware of innovation theater.
Yeah.
Right? Because I think it's, building on what Terry said, I think you can do the innovation, but I think where the rubber meets the road is, how does that innovation actually land inside the edifice of the corporation, actually get to scale? I don't think there's any paucity of innovation at the edges. but does it actually get liftoff within the corporation, right? And so to pay attention to that.
Yeah. Very last question, and we're at time. Vishy and Terry, I'm a startup. I've figured out that I fit your interest level. I'm at the stage that you want. What's the way that I reach out to you, Vishy? Do I ping you directly? Is there somebody at the team that I should ping? How do I kind of get connected with AT&T?
Shoot me an email, look me up on LinkedIn, and I can get that going. Simple.
Awesome. Terry?
Yeah, I'm happy to get emails, but I'll tell you the truth, like cold emails or cold calls don't work as well, right? But if you have Foundation reach out to us, it's going to have a much higher chance of getting a meeting. So leverage that venture relationship if you have it. We put companies like Foundation on a pedestal, and their recommendation goes a long way.
Thanks a ton, Terry, for the kind words. I'm going to be expecting 100 emails in my inbox in an hour or two, I'm sure. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. We're going to be back at the conference at 2 p.m. for a number of other panel talks. So you'll be able to access them on your Hopin platform. And Terry and Vishy, thank you so much, both of you, for joining us today.
Thank you, Sid.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, Sid.